In Chapter 4, Lesson 3, we're going to take a look at the eastern half of the United States and now think about it in the context of what daily life is like. Now, this lesson is unique to any other lesson we're going to study this year in geography because it's actually talking about where we live and what our daily life is like. So you're going to have to put your reflective thinking hat on and think about what is my life like and what are the things that are happening around where I live geographically and economically and human interaction wise that shape how I understand the world and how I go about my business. Now I'm going to compare what I do in my life and what I experience to the different places in the eastern half of the United States that we talk about. We're going to learn about the differences between rural areas where there's not a lot of population, there's still more of an agricultural basis for economic activity, and then we're going to focus on the major metropolitan areas like Chicago, New York, New Orleans, Atlanta, these huge major cities where tons of people live and there's tons of economic activity and tons of things that are happening because of the geographic resources that the eastern half of the United States provides. I'm excited because this lesson again focuses on what daily life is like, both as our human interaction and the environment is considered and also as all of this geography factors into what affects your life and what affects my life. Let's dig a little deeper into that. Let's go. Chapter 4, Lesson 3, Daily Life in the Region. In front of me I have my textbook open and set to read through and or listen to this text. And I also have in front of me my note page that has different directions for each of the different sections. In the beginning portion we're going to talk about the major metropolitan areas that make up a huge part of the eastern half of the United States. We're going to look at the areas of New York City, Chicago, Atlanta, and New Orleans. We specifically need to identify in our reading where they're located, the history of these places that are listed and given to us, and then what major industrial activity and economic activity comes from those regions, as in why were those settlements or those cities built there in the first place, and why do a lot of people want to live in those places. And we can compare all of that information to the major metropolitan area that we live in right here in Milwaukee. Next, we're going to talk about the U.S. government and how the government has an influence in how our daily life is operating, answer a number of these questions by filling in the blank that's provided. And lastly, we're going to take a look at everyday life in terms of how the economic activity governs kind of how we do what we do and why we do what we do. A lot of times people live where they live based on the job that they have that allows them to provide for themselves or provide for their family. And a lot of that is based on how our country has developed and the history of that country and where that industry is taking place today. So we're going to understand the different levels of the economy and where we fit into that based on where we live and what is going on in the eastern half of the United States. Let's jump into it. Daily life in the region, Chapter 4, Lesson 3. As you read about the major metropolitan areas, you're going to come to recognize that a major metropolitan area means it's a large city with a high population. The guiding question for this section before you read says, what is it like to live here? Now, you'd be able to best answer this because guess what? Right in Milwaukee, we have a major metropolitan area. There's a high population, there's a lot of people, there's a major city, there's a downtown with the big skyscrapers, and you're going to compare that to what you read about in these other major areas. Here's a map of the United States that shows where these major huge cities are, and then the cities that are surrounded by suburban areas that create a larger area of overall population. For example, Chicago is one that we're going to read about in just a minute here, but Chicago has this entire region that surrounds it. It's called Chicagoland. Now, every one of these other cities in this region isn't called Chicago. There are different names for these places, but the entire area is called a metropolitan area. Milwaukee is the largest city in Wisconsin where we live and has the largest population of the cities, but it's surrounded by other suburban cities or other cities around it that make it into a larger metropolitan area. For example, you have Brown Deer, Wauwatosa, West Allis, Greenfield, Franklin, Brookfield, Menominee Falls, Germantown, Mequon, all these places that are somewhat connected to the city, but they are outside of what would be the city limits themselves. All of these put together make up the major metropolitan areas, and people who live in these areas share kind of a way of life because they're used to living where more people are and more activity is happening. Right now would be a good time to pause the video and read through the very first section on major metropolitan areas. Next, we're going to talk about those metropolitan areas specifically, and we're going to fill out in our notes the information that we can find out about each of these cities. The first one is New York. New York is one of the most densely populated areas on our East Coast. It's Located on the Atlantic coast and the mouth of the Hudson River, it's the most populous city in the United States. This famously diverse city is home to more than 9 million people, making it one of the most heavily populated cities in the world. New York began as a Dutch colonial port city called New Amsterdam. Although it is better known today as a hub of culture and commerce, New York is still home to one of the busiest ports in North America. It's a dense cluster of urban areas called boroughs. Those 5 different boroughs are pictured here. You have those boroughs being connected by streets, bridges, trains, and underwater passages. The 5 boroughs are Manhattan. The island of Manhattan is right here, this kind of dark yellow. You've got Brooklyn. You've got Queens. Queens is here. Brooklyn's here. The Bronx and Staten Island. These 5 boroughs make up the entire city of New York City, but have their own designation within these areas, boroughs or like neighborhoods. Though it's the smallest of the 5 boroughs, Staten Island, only 22.6 square miles. The island of Manhattan is cultural, political, and economic center of New York City. Sorry, Manhattan right here, the smallest of the 5, is the highest populated, and it's the cultural, political, and economic center of this part of the city. Now let's take a look at our notes from this section to make sure we have all of those pieces of information filled in correctly. New York City, located on the Atlantic coast at the mouth of the Hudson River. It was originally called New Amsterdam as it was settled. Home to one of the busiest port cities. And made up of 5 boroughs or neighborhoods. Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, Bronx, Staten Island. The industry. New York is famous for the finance industry. That's where Wall Street is located. Advertising. Madison Street is known for major advertising to be produced here, as in the different types of commercials and campaigns that companies make. Entertainment and tourism. It's a popular place for people to visit New York City to see all the different sights and sounds and locations. The entertainment in terms of Broadway, the different types of shows and plays that come from there, and tourism, people want to see Lady Liberty, Statue of Liberty, and just the major city itself and those 5 different boroughs. The next city we have to read about is Chicago, one that you might be really familiar with because Chicago is located just south of Milwaukee. So you go further north, here's Racine, Kenosha, and then Milwaukee is located just right here, also on what is Lake Michigan. This area that surrounds Chicago is known as Chicagoland. This major metropolitan area surrounds this entire portion of the city. Now, a lot of the cities that we're going to talk about and that you may have already recognized that are major cities are located by bodies of water. Chicago is located by a body of water, but it didn't grow to be a major city until the different types of transportation would have advanced. It used to be a small settlement between Lake Michigan and between the Mississippi River over here, but once it was connected by railroads to the rest of the country, from the East Coast to Chicago, then to the West Coast, it became this central hub for all the different railroad activity from the East Coast to the West Coast. It was a huge, important transportation destination. And then eventually, as the St. Lawrence Seaway was created for the different locks and levees to get ships from the Atlantic Ocean into the interior portion of the Great Lakes, Chicago grew and grew and grew even more because of that centralized location in the heart of our country. Chicago is located in Illinois, just south of Wisconsin here. It is a major, major city, one of the largest cities in this central portion of the United States and in the Midwest. And it remains one of the most important centers for shipping, transportation, and industry. The city is one of America's leading producers of steel, machinery, and manufactured products. Several large printing and publishing companies are located in Chicago as well as other major financial institutions such as the Chicago Stock Exchange. Let's go and check out our notes on Chicago. It's located between Lake Michigan, if I could type, and the Mississippi River. The history of Chicago, it was a small settlement until it was connected to the rest of the country by railroad. And canals through the St. Lawrence Seaway. It's the center of railroad travel. In the mid-1800s. This would have connected the East Coast to the West Coast as kind of the stopping point or this halfway checkpoint for the different import and export activities from that Midwest. So you get things going in between them, and also as a way to ship things from this Midwest area to the coasts for more railroad activity, more type of economic activity. The industry here, shipping, transportation, steel machinery, manufacturing, printing and publishing, and finance. Printing and publishing in terms of making and writing books, textbooks, magazines, and publishing those, and then finance, the financial industry dealing with different types of money and or investments. Next in your reading, we have the study of the city of Atlanta, down in the southeastern portion of the United States. Atlanta is a major interior city as well. A lot like Chicago, Chicago is on the Great Lakes, a body of water, but Atlanta isn't on necessarily a body of water. It is, however, a vibrant city, and it serves as Georgia's capital city. So here's where Georgia is located, down in the southeastern portion of the United States. Here's a map of Georgia, and right here in the northern central portion of Georgia is the city of Atlanta. Atlanta is a historic city and a modern metropolis, means it's a huge city with many metropolitan areas that surround the interior or the downtown area itself. During the Civil War, Atlanta served as a supply depot for the Confederate Army. Most of the city buildings were burned during a devastating invasion of the Union Army in 1864, so it was rebuilt after the Civil War. Today, Atlanta is a strong center for transportation, industry, trade, education, and culture. It's been called the commercial center of the modern South. A wide array of industries, including publishing, telecommunications, banking, insurance, military supply, and manufacturing, have headquarters in Atlanta. The city's major factories produce electrical equipment, chemicals, packaged foods, paper products, and aircrafts. It's also known to have the largest airport in the United States. Let's take a look at our notes for the city of Atlanta. As you've read through the section, you should be able to fill this out and check with Mr. Shane. Atlanta is located at the southern edge of the Appalachian Mountain Range. In the northern portion of Georgia, it's the capital city of Georgia. In its history, it was a Confederate supply depot during the Civil War. It was burned by the Union Army, and it was rebuilt. Became a symbol of strength and rebirth in the South after the Civil War was over, because there was a lot of healing that had to happen in our country, especially in the South when the Emancipation Proclamation took place. The people who would have operated in the normal life with the approval of slavery were no longer allowed to do such an atrocious act to innocent and wonderful people. Hopefully, through the rebuilding of the city, you see people kind of recovering from that, and Atlanta now thriving and growing into a major city of tons and tons of diversity and opportunity. Its industry, reason why it's so large and why it has the largest airport in the United States, is because it's a hub for transportation, trade, education, culture, publishing, telecommunications, so like cell phone and internet companies, banking, insurance, military supply, and manufacturing. Mr. Shane had the opportunity to tour the Ron Clark Academy, one of the most high-performing elementary schools or middle schools in the United States. the Ron Clark Academy. Ron Clark himself, the master teacher, has been on TV with Oprah and has been heralded as one of the best educators. I got the chance to visit their school right in the outskirts of downtown Atlanta. So Atlanta is an incredible city, a really large area with tons and tons of people and tons of opportunity based on the different industries that are there. Even though it has a rocky past being a part of what would have been the Confederate South, it's kind of turned into a flourishing region in the southern portion of the United States. The last city we're going to read about is New Orleans. New Orleans, also located in the south, however, not in an interior. We're located right here on the coast of the Gulf Coast here in Louisiana. It's 110 miles from the Gulf of Mexico. It's a major port area that allows lots of activity on the Mississippi River. Here's what New Orleans looks like from the skyscape, located right on that river, and has tons and tons of history from this part of the country. New Orleans has been a shipping town along the Mississippi during times of peace. New Orleans was an important center for transportation and trade. In times of war, such as during the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and the Civil War, New Orleans became a major stop along supply lines that served the military and civilians. Located only 110 miles from the Gulf of Mexico, New Orleans eventually was connected to the Gulf by river channels, making it easier for ships to enter and leave the city. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina struck the Gulf of Mexico's coast, and the storm raged from Louisiana to Florida. In New Orleans, levees failed when the storm surged, and this flooded low-lying areas, trapping thousands of people. Thousands of people were left homeless, and many people died. Their houses were destroyed. They actually had to house people right here in the Superdome. This is where the New Orleans Saints play. They had to house people here because so many other places and peoples were damaged because of the hurricane. Hurricane Katrina was one of the worst natural disasters in U.S. history. Some neighborhoods and areas have been completely rebuilt, and others have never recovered and actually have been abandoned since that time. New Orleans today remains an important commercial center in the eastern United States. Manufacturing and transportation contribute to the city's economy. New Orleans is renowned for its rich cultural traditions, including spicy Cajun and Creole foods, and its original musical styles and colorful celebrations, such as the world-famous Mardi Gras. New Orleans was one of the first centers for jazz music, and it's a city of proud people, art, music, language, and architecture, in a bold and unique mixture of French, Spanish, Caribbean, and African cultures. Tourism is a major part of the economic activity here in New Orleans. Taking a look at and finalizing our notes from this section, New Orleans is located 110 miles from the Gulf of Mexico. However, it is still connected with the Mississippi River and the different channels that have been built so that trade and the activity can get from the ocean to this interior part of Louisiana. It began as a shipping town. It served as a major depot for supply lines during war. Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and the Civil War. And one of the major historical events here is its damage by Hurricane Katrina in 2005. It's a center for commercial trade, manufacturing, transportation, because a lot of people want to go and visit, and tourism. That should complete your notes for that first section. In the next section, we're going to answer questions about the U.S. government. Let's take a look. The U.S. government begins in this section as you're reading through, all about the way in which the government's establishment and the government's actions now affect our everyday life. So we're going to review some ways in which the government is structured and built, and then turn that into the understanding of how we go about living our lives under such a government. Our country was established, as we studied in the historical aspect, from the 13 colonies that gathered together to form this Constitution to tell the English settlement, the English king and ruler, that they were no longer going to be a part of the no taxation without representation, and were going to leave England and be their own country. We fought the Revolutionary War and won, and the Constitution was ratified to give us the first piece of government document, and this was going to be what our federal republic, our national government, is going to be based upon. And all the different states or all the different colonies that became states accepted this constitution, and it still, over 200 years later, has become the governing piece of legislation, the governing kind of basic laws of how our country operates. Now, there's different amendments that have happened to the Constitution. Those first amendments are called the Bill of Rights, that guarantee the basic rights of citizens. From this Constitution and from those amendments, we have the establishment of 3 different branches of government. So in this Constitution, we wrote up the idea of not having a tyrant that we were living under when it was the English settlements, the 13 original colonies. So to take away power from any one person or to limit the power from a tyrant, we established the 3 different branches of government, which are the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. Here you can see that the legislative branch is in charge of making laws. They approve presidential appointments. There are 2 senators from each state, and the number of congressmen is based on population. So there's 2 ways in which we go about getting representation in our democracy. 2 senators from each state, so all 50 states have 2. There's 100 senators, and then there's another that's based on population size, because some states are a lot bigger than others, so they should have a little bit more say in comparison to some states that have a lot smaller population or a lot smaller area overall. The executive branch is the president. He signs laws, he vetoes laws, as in he can check the legislative branch so they can't just make their own laws and then he doesn't approve of those. He can pardon people, that means to forgive them for something that they have done. He appoints federal judges, and he's elected for every 4 years. The different terms for senators are varying, and there's no term limit on how many years you can serve in those different capacities. Here's where you get what's called career politicians that show up. Every 4 years, a president is elected, and then he can serve 2 terms under those 4 years. The judicial branch decides if laws are constitutional. So they write the law. The judicial branch says, does the Constitution approve of that law? And then the president signs that law if it meets those other criteria. The judicial branch are appointed by the president. This is the Supreme Court, and there are 9 justices. That way, if there's ever a vote, there's never an even number, and there's a tie. The judicial branch can overturn rulings by other judges. You'll notice right now in our country, there's a time in which Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away, and there's now 8 seats on the Supreme Court. Now, because there are only 8 seats, anything that would come to the Supreme Court, if there was ever a vote, there would be 4 and 4. Hence why there's a rush, a move to try and fill that seat and appoint the next Supreme Court justice. Supreme Court justices serve for their entire life or until they're going to step down. Obviously, Ruth Bader Ginsburg in her elder years was still serving on the Supreme Court, even though I believe she was in her late 80s before she passed. After reading about the 3 branches of government, we're going to come to the understanding as you read about the government actions and how they affect land and how they affect people. Here'd be a good chance to pause and read through those paragraphs in that section, the 2 paragraphs in the government affecting land and the 4 paragraphs on government affecting people. 3 branches of government make laws and decisions that affect our nation's land. Some laws and decisions protect the environment. For example, the president has the authority to set aside the use of national parks. Here's an example of the different types of national parks that exist in the United States. These are government-owned lands, government-owned businesses and properties. So there are people that are government employees that work in these places that you and I can go visit and experience because we are citizens of the United States, and these are the public lands that are available to us as wonderful resources for vacation or leisure or recreation. Obviously out west here where there's less population and more of the mountainous activity, there's a lot more of those and more prevalent places where those national parks exist. If you remember back to 5th grade, I believe you did a research project on the different types of national parks and where they are located in the United States. Another environmental program is called the Superfund. Another way in which the government controls things is how, let me back up. Another place in which you can experience government lands, not only in the national parks, but within your state park. Here's a picture of Wisconsin. Every one of these little pine trees are the different types of state parks that you can go to, visit, camp, and enjoy as well. Another type of activity in terms of how the government operates is a superfund. So the government can create these public places and public lands. It also can protect the lands that the government has. This environmental program is called Superfund, which its purpose is to clean the abandoned and hazardous waste sites. A lot of times throughout our history, when different companies have been created and different activities have been going on in those companies and what they're producing, they produce waste, and those waste places can be toxic. So the Superfund is government tax dollars being spent to go up and clean those different places. For example, if there was a gas station that was put in a place and there's a huge gas tank inside buried into the ground that for years and years and years people pump their gas out of at the gas station, and eventually that kind of goes away or gets abandoned because they built a new shinier gas station and people don't use it anymore, that site is now a toxic location that needs to be cleaned up. The government controls the agency of the Superfund to go and clean those places, and here's a map of the United States which shows where that activity is happening. So they're doing positive things to help out and affect the land in this area. The next section of our reading identifies the way in which government actions affect people. Here's how we're going to think about how the way in which our government has been structured influences how you and I live each and every day. As you read this section, you're going to understand that the government is in charge of creating what are the civil rights of people. And through the history in our country, based on the colonial overtake of what would have been the Native American lands, let's go back. The next section highlights how government action affects people. As our country has been established through colonialism, there has been a lot of oversight in terms of how people have been treated in the history of our country. Our country was settled by people who took over the land from Native Americans. Our country was then built on and based on this system of slavery in which free workers, free labor, was used to exploit and build up economic activity until that was deemed inhumane and immoral to where we fought a country to end slavery and end that atrocity. It doesn't mean that civil rights have been something that have gone away, as they are very prevalent in today's society. The civil rights movement took place back in the 1960s after years and years and years of what would have been after the Civil War, after emancipation, Jim Crow laws that were still being used and segregation that was still being used to keep people in a lesser state in society based on the traditional way that things had been done. Unfortunately, because of that racism and inequality, there was a major civil movement. Well, that movement has been slowly being rekindled here in the United States through a lot of the recent activities that you can see through the different types of things that are going on today. The Black Lives Matter movement and activities to call to question the different ways in which police brutality come into play in the economic activity, or economic disadvantage comes into play, as in why are people in the state that they are? Is it because of the way civil rights have been established, or is it because of the people's actions? Through the course and history of our country, we can see that there's been major movements, especially with a prominent figure such as Martin Luther King, that has brought to the table the idea that these things need to change, and if we're going to consider ourselves the greatest nation, we're going to look at how we're treating our own people here and moving those people forward. After reading about the civil rights movement and thinking about how that applies in today's world, I'd like you to think about your own life. Here's a little picture of a mirror, what you're going to think about. What's my life? What is the religion I practice and the ethnicity that I have, and how does that influence the way in which I live? And then what's the economic activity that's happening in our country that also kind of factors into how I live each and every day? Remember, in our country, we were first based as an agricultural society. The first people that settled here wanted to get land and start growing crops to build this way in which they could sustain themselves. After a lot more resources were discovered, we moved into a manufacturing and industrial society in which we've changed into the Industrial Revolution. Now we're manufacturing and creating things. Once you get to this point in a development of a country and you're building things, you're going to move from the industrial type of economy into a service-based economy where people are really specialized in what they do. You can actually pay other people to do certain industrial tasks because they've mastered those types of activities. The last and the kind of the defining factor of the most developed countries in our world today are the computer and information-based economies, in which you now have tech companies and internet companies that are the biggest kind of movers in economic activity because of the connections they can have to tons and tons of people all at the same time and different parts of the world all at the same time. These are the different levels of the economy. I want you to think about where you fit in and maybe where your parents work or somebody that you know works in the different levels of the economy. Not just because they're at considered different levels, like this is the first, second, third, and fourth, or primary, secondary, tertiary. level of the economy does not mean that anybody's job is more important or less important than others. It just is a definition of how these things kind of stack up throughout the course and history of how these countries are developed. And it also influences how you fit into the different parts of everyday life in the eastern part of the United States. The last thing you have to do for your homework is to answer the questions numbers 1 through 5 in complete sentences on the U.S. government, and then put into order the proper way in which the economy is ordered by putting the right number here. Now these arrows are kind of diffusing. You're going to put the numbers in the right order. The numbers should tell you what is the first, second, third, and fourth level of the economy. God's blessings.